Hi everyone, again. My name is Joakim Kreutz. I am associate professor at the Department of Political Science, Stockholm University, and as well as part of a project at Uppsala University's Department of Peace and Conflict Research. And I will talk a little bit about the sort of empirical background of this issue of cultural heritage and war. There is usually a lot of debate about, okay, what exactly do we know about this? We need to have some empirical groundwork to situate our discussions in, and together with some colleagues, I've tried to do a little bit of this, focusing on one subsection of cultural heritage, namely religious buildings. And the starting point is, well, this quote I bet many of you have seen, is that there has been a growing recognition that cultural heritage is something that should be protected in conflict, and attacking it can even constitute a war crime. But the question then that comes up when you look at these issues is that, well, to begin with, how do we identify the cultural heritage? How do we identify the places, the spaces that we want to protect? The second one is, how much does this happen? How common is this? And the third is, so if this is going to be a war crime, so what? Is it just something that becomes relevant as some sort of victor's justice afterwards, that we will go back after the war has ended and say, okay, these actions were bad, and whoever has the most power afterwards can decide which ones were proportionate or acceptable, and which ones were actually breaching the laws of war. So what we're trying to do is, maybe this actually has an impact also on other war crimes. Maybe attacking cultural spaces leads to more people killed, more refugee streams, something like that. And we don't really know that so far. We know it from many case studies, but it's usually very anecdotal, because we only hear about these high-profile cases saying that, oh, after Palmyra, the conflict escalated and continued for many years in Syria. A lot of people tried to run away, but we can't really know that it was because of Palmyra in any way. So this is sort of a little bit of the empirical puzzle that I and some of my colleagues were interested in. I will not talk a lot about the sort of the debate about cultural heritage and war, and instead focus on presenting what we did and what we found, and we can have a discussion afterwards about what it means and whether there is something that we should have thought of. But there is some research out here that has sort of summarized the different ways that war can hurt cultural heritage sites. And some of them have to do more with sort of the planning stages of a campaign or a conflict, the resources needed to protect sites when everything gets messy and expensive. Collateral damage, that what happens, you are aiming for the opposition troops, but happen to also tear down a building or a site, and so forth. We also talk about whether this is something that happens in the form of looting, that can be seen as a negative point when we call it looting, or a spoils of war thing if it's sort of sanctioned from the victor's point of view. And then there is the final argument, which is that this is specific targeting. And that's exactly the point that I will be talking about. So I'm not going to be covering any of this lack of planning, lack of resources, lack of rebuilding. I'm not going to focus so much on looting and how this finances rebel groups. But when it's specifically targeted by the warring sides, And why would warring sides choose to target particular spaces, objects? Well, either it can be because this is part of the conflict issue. The two sides are competing over different narratives of history. They want to destroy the other's claims. I mean, one example of this is how the mosques in Bosnia were razed to the ground in order to sort of convince Bosniaks that they didn't move back there even after the war. They weren't just destroyed, they were razed completely to sort of take away any sign that this used to be a territory you lived in, you inhabited. There can also be a military strategic issue. When people are hiding in church towers with snipers in order to shoot on advancing troops. If this is a good place of keeping your weapons, if this may be a place where you do a lot of your recruitment for new troops into your armed group, spread a lot of your propaganda. And the third aspect relates to the signaling theory of war, where you sort of want to send a signal to the opponent that this place, we can even attack this place. You cannot be safe anywhere. A weak group may choose to attack a very high-profile case in order to show that they have the capabilities to do that and to hurt the enemy where it really, really hurts a lot. And this is usually something that, in the modern version anyway, is attributed to terrorism and why people attack civilian targets instead of engaging in straightforward battles. So that's sort of the overarching interest that this comes into. And the problem then, okay, so how can we identify which spaces, which places, which objects, which houses are cultural heritage? And we chose to focus on religious communities, religious spaces. And that is, from our point of view, something that can be referred to as a most likely case. There is a lot of literature about religion and conflict, and religion and sociology that indicate that these places are ones that are very much invested with meaning for the local community. And that has to do with going to the temple, going to the mosque, going to the church, going to the synagogue is something that you do repeatedly. You do it on a regular basis to some extent. You do it during your big events in your life, at childbirth, at marriage, at funeral of family members and so forth. So this is something that is very, very close and very visible in community life and in the individual's identity. And maybe a museum is not quite as strongly felt. People don't usually go to the same museum every Sunday. So this is where we think that, okay, if there is an effect, we would expect it to find it in this type of community buildings. Some other researchers claim that religious, because of these repeated procedurals, and also because religion is tying both the past with the present and with the future, it set up sort of a set of moral rules about how to live our lives. And it implicitly or at least not very obviously include a little bit of a ranking where one type of behavior, the behavior from your particular religious place, is a little bit better than the behavior of others. So you are sort of a little bit creating this exclusive in-group. Even if it's inviting for everyone, you still sort of have this community that can justify punishment to others that don't follow the same rules, that don't belong to the same community, because they are not quite as much members of the in-group. So we think that if there is an attack and the destruction of this place that is very central to people's identity, where they have spent a lot of their personal life, personal high moments, and where actually the doctrine also linked them with their ancestors and future generations, that will connect very closely to the individuals, an attack to the individuals in the identity. So we would expect this would be a case where people would react more strongly than in most other cases of cultural heritage destruction. We may be wrong, but this is our assumption to focus on this subset. And then how to find out information about this. We were fortunate through my colleagues at Uppsala University to have access to a great data source. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program has been tracking violent political conflict going back from 1989 to the present, and collect that on an event basis. And what do they mean with violent political conflict? Well, it includes international war, so wars between two countries, Ethiopia and Eritrea, for example, in the late 1990s. It includes civil war or internal conflict, or intrastate war, depending on the terminology, which is essentially fighting between the government of a state and an organized rebel group that has a political goal. It also includes something they refer to as non-state conflict, which is both fighting between two organized groups, two militias in a country against each other, but also communal violence. So you can have these sort of riots between Hindus and Muslims in India, between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria, between different ethnic groups and so forth. And it also captures one-sided violence, which is attacks by an organized actor targeting civilians, people that are not part of another armed group. This includes terrorism, but it also includes the Rwandan genocide. It includes ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, and so forth. So it's a lot of different things that this captures. So this is all coded on an event basis. And since we have access to the underlying material, not just the stuff that Uppsala produces and in their output, we also had access to a bunch of different events that almost met these regulatory rules, but where it was not included because it was a little bit unclear who was the perpetrator. It was a little bit unclear whether this was actually one-sided or a non-state, whether this, and it's a little bit unclear whether the actor had political goals or not. So we have a bigger underlying reporting of political violent events than what is being summarized and produced by Uppsala, which gave us an underlying data set of 174,222 events from 138 different countries in the world between 1989 and 2014. One thing I should mention about this data source is that all of these events have one small specificity, and that is that there has to be a report that they led to at least one person dead. So we don't have events when no one was killed, unfortunately. We would love to have that, but in order to do that, we need to have access to a huge database of all news articles or something like that, that hopefully in the future we can move into that direction. But so these are all events where at least one person was killed, or at least there were some credible report that one person was killed, because some of them are a little bit unclear. The presentation of this data looks like this on the Uppsala website. And so these are the sort of summary of where all these events are taking place in the world. You can move in to more detail and see some basic information about each specific event and where it took place. And this is sort of as much information that is being publicly available. We could then link this information directly with the underlying news report. And this is of course not the same one, because I showed you an event in Burma, and this is from the Philippines. And so we get access to this news report. And what we did, and I'm happy to answer questions about the details of the methodology later, because I'm not going to go so much into it now. But for a few years, we sort of worked with a supervised machine learning approach that helped us identify the events that were most likely to have information about an attack on any house of worship, of any mosque, synagogue, church, temple, and so forth. And we basically ended up with this type of reports. And then we had some coders that helped us read all the ones that we had a slight suspicion that there could be something there, and a random selection of the other events. Meaning that we did some tests, and we basically have 100% recall score, what is called, when we basically are sure that we didn't miss anything of the events targeted. That gave us a total of almost 2,000 attacks on different houses of worship. And if you look at the left figure here, you can see that over time, and this is as the proportion of the total number of events for that year, so this is not the absolute number of events. But over time, we saw that there was a slight increase in this happening, with a big jump specifically in 2005, which is not surprising, because that's when a lot of the violence, intersectarian violence, increased in Iraq, but also there was an upsurge in attacks on temples and mosques in southern Thailand, in the insurgency there. In the right panel here, you can see the type of violence this constituted. And I don't know if you can see that. It's kind of small, but the green lines are one-sided. So basically, terrorist events, attacks on civilians, which is not surprising, because it's not very common that we know that military bases are inside churches, temples, and so forth. We were a little bit surprised that the red lines were not more prominent, because that's non-state, that's communal violence between these Hindus, Muslims, Sunni Shia in Pakistan, Christians and Muslims in Indonesia, and so forth. It seems like there is a fair amount of attacks there, but not as dominant as maybe we thought from the outset. And the blue lines, the bottom ones, are the ones that are linked to either international or civil war. So they are specifically battles. So those are the ones that in some way could be attributed to collateral damage, that they just happen to have a firefight in the mosque or in the church. So what can we know if we start analyzing this? We started looking at, okay, where do these attacks occur? And we have sort of 5 main competing ideas about why it would be the case. The first one is maybe the most classical one, going back all the way to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. When there is a lot of religion, of course they will start fighting. Or when they are sort of, there is a lot of competition, that will lead to friction, that will lead to some sort of conflict. So maybe that's when it happens. We also used a World Value Survey. No, it's not World Value Survey. It was a survey asking globally how important people considered religion to be. That was, unfortunately, that survey was collected in 2014. So after most of our data. But it seems like this is not something that changes very suddenly in between, but also something for us to work more with in the future. We looked at sort of religion as a political aspect in life, and whether religious freedom was protected in the Constitution. And then we looked at two sort of specific conflict-related factors, and that is, was there some rebels there that had stated religious goals that basically were fighting for introducing some sort of religious order or some sort of or fighting against a religious rule in a country. And then the final one, if the armed conflict in the area was between groups that belong to different religions or different sects, so it could be Sunni Shia as well. And we also coded those for the communal violence to see if that was the case. And what we found was that attacks on houses of worship were actually less likely where religion was seen as very important. And it was less likely where religious freedom was protected. It was, however, more likely when there were organizations there that specifically had religious goals or were fighting against a state that represented a different religion. For the religious diversity, we didn't find any clear result at all in this. And it's actually a little bit surprising because when we, and this is the only graph like this I'm going to show you, it seems like while we can see that the most likely situation where we will see these attacks is the top line, the yellow one, which is when you have both religious goals and fighting against an opponent with a different religious belonging. That's when we see the most likely case of attacks. The second one, the red one, is where you have a religious identity on the two sides, but not specifically religious goals. So not specifically that you want to impose a religious state or something like that. That is also consistently more likely. When you don't have, when you have an actor with a religious goal, but not fighting against representatives from another religion, there is a little bit of an increase, but not very strongly, and not in all societies. And when there is not neither of them, we see the least risk of attacks on religious places. But what we see here is how this is distributed along the religious fractionalization index. And this is the likelihood that two randomly drawn people come from the same religion. If you go out on the street and ask two people, do you come from the same religion? And then there is an index going from it's very unlikely to it's very likely that they are different. So these are the more religiously diverse countries. So consistently we see that attacks on religious spaces is more common in less religious diverse cases than in the ones where you have a lot of religious competition. So kind of the opposite of the Huntington hypothesis, that as we get closer together we will start having these clashes. Here it seems that no, actually, if you get closer together, it doesn't turn violent. And there is an interesting similarity here in some of the recent work on ethnic conflict, saying that it's not actually so much the diversity in ethnicities, but when some ethnicities are actively discriminated against. That's the key that creates conflict or creates war. So that's sort of what we are looking at, where it happens. What is the effect on these attacks? We can't really say so much about long-term effects because we have a relatively short data set. But we do find that these attacks tend to occur in the years with the most violence. So the country years with the most violence are the ones that also have a greater likelihood of having an attack towards a place of worship. But when we control for the capabilities of the warring sides, the strength of the army, the strength of the rebel group, the inclusion of foreign support to any of the parties, then there is no longer a relationship between high levels of violence. And those capabilities is the sort of the predominant explanation in the literature why we see more violence in some cases than other. Basically, if you have more guns, you end up having more violence. And that holds here too. It's not affected with the houses of worship. And when we look at sort of like the lingering effect for the year after, we see no effect at all of attacks on this. So it's not that houses of worships are being attacked and people go home and hold a grudge and mobilize, and then 1 year later they start fighting. So we don't really see that slightly medium long-term effect. But it should be worth saying also that the different patterns after these attacks on houses of worships are very, very different. There are some cases where there's no violence at all afterwards. There are some where it goes extremely an extreme escalation. But what we're looking at is sort of like the overall trends and if they are sort of like strong enough to say something compared to other explanations for why this happens. So then we're thinking maybe there is a short-term effect, shorter than this 1 year. And maybe it's local. Maybe it's only really people living close to this mosque, this temple, this church that is being attacked that feel this need to go out and defend it and revenge it. So what we did then was that we constructed a data set, and this is to the left you see a picture of the example of Burma, or Myanmar, that we sort of drew a circle around each event that we had coded in our data set, all 174,000 events, and measured how much violence was in that circle before compared to after an attack against the house of worship happened. So basically, did violence increase in the same area compared to how much it was before? And seeing if there is a difference here for specifically these attacks on religious communities. And then we did find that there is a very, very short-term effect. If we compare the violence 2 weeks before with the violence 2 weeks after, we see a visible escalation of violence. To put that into sense, so we had 3 different levels of these circles. So if we compare just the 50-kilometer radius around every attack, we can see that there is, on average, 310 more deaths after an attack on a religious house of worship compared to any other target. Measuring the 2 weeks before compared to the 2 weeks after. For a bigger area of 300 kilometers around the attack, we see a total of 600 more deaths for these 2 weeks. If we extend it even further, we see a smaller size, but still a substantial increase of 486 more deaths in the 2 weeks after, compared to how much violent it was before, and compared with targets that are not houses of worship. But it is very briefly. It doesn't continue after these first 2 weeks. If we look at it for 2 months, we no longer see that. In many cases, actually, violence decreases in the 2 months. And we also find that if the attack was perpetrated by one of these actors with religious goals, then we don't see this effect, this short-term effect. So this is something that actually has a bigger effect when it comes surprising in society. What does this mean? Well, we compared it to some other potential scenarios of attacks that could lead to an escalation of violence, and we find that the effect is very similar to cases when there has been a very, very high intensity attack that creates a lot of attention. So an attack on a house of worship has a similar effect as an attack that kills more than 50 people. A really massive terrorist attack. And this is, we see that even when we check for the possibility that this is actually capturing the same type of attacks, it doesn't. These are two different ways that, but they have the same effect with a very, very short-term escalation of violence. Since we didn't see that this is something that is presupposed by the presence of these already organized religious rebel groups, it seems to be that this is more of a communal response. This is more of an immediate, this is more in the form of riots, in the form of short-term mobilization. It doesn't necessarily mean that people will sign up and join a rebel group and go into the forest and train for 3 months and so forth. But in the immediate aftermath of having this attack on your identity, there is sort of like a short window of anger that can lead to an escalation of violence, specifically locally, but spreading relatively far. And an example of this, if you want me to give it, is that the attack on the on the mosque in Iraq, in Samarra, in 2005, in February, which that attack actually didn't kill anyone, but that was immediately followed by a huge intensification of violence, both in the sort of battles between the Iraqi army, American occupation force, and rebels, but also these death squads, these extrajudicial killings, these riots, these sort of different forms of victimization that we don't still exactly know who was responsible for. So from this, we can conclude, or we can at least tentatively conclude, that it is possible to look at attacks on religious bases and maybe cultural heritage as something that definitely hurts the identity of people and could constitute a war crime for that sense, because it is similar to a terrorist attack in many ways, at least a high fatality terrorist attack. And besides that, we want to go further with this study. What can we more draw for conclusions? Well, we also know that conflicts with more violence are more difficult to settle. They are usually longer. They are usually more difficult to keep the peace afterwards, and so forth. So if this is one of the triggers that provokes more violence, then this is actually something that this has an effect beyond the damage to the cultural heritage or to the identity of the religious community. It is something that can expand and extend the war. Knowing this better means that we can help that to influence policy. We can maybe predict not only where these attacks happen, but also what happens in the aftermath of one of these attacks. And that's the first step to be able to prevent it. And of course, having this information about the level of attacks on these identity symbolic places will make it much easier for peacekeepers to identify where are the potential hotspots where the war can restart if during a sort of fractious peace process. And yeah, thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.